In Season 1, her powers are raw and unstable. She can flip a van with her mind, but she can't always control when it happens or how much it costs her physically. She gets nosebleeds. She collapses. The power is there, but it's eating her alive. And the thing that grounds her, the thing that gives her a reason to use that power for good instead of just surviving, is Mike. Not in a romantic way, at least not yet, in a human way. Mike gives her a name. He gives her a home. He gives her egos. He gives her the first experience she's ever had of being treated like a person instead of a weapon. And that's what makes the Season 1 finale so devastating. She sacrificed herself to save the boys, not because Brenner trained her to fight monsters, but because Mike taught her what it means to have friends. Friends don't lie. 3 words, the most important line in the show, and it came from a girl who had to learn what a friend was at the age of 12 because nobody had ever bothered to tell her before. Season 2 pushes 11 into isolation again. Hopper's cabin, the door that has to stay closed, 3 inches open, is a compromise. And here's a detail that the production team buried so deep that most fans didn't catch it until years later. In Season 4, when 11 is living in California without Hopper, her bedroom door is still 3 inches open. She's thousands of miles from Hawkins. Hopper is in a Russian prison, but the door is still open exactly 3 inches. Because that rule isn't just a rule anymore. It's a connection to the closest thing she's ever had to a father. The set designers confirmed this was intentional. 3 inches, across 4 seasons and 2,000 miles. Season 2 also gives us Episode 7, The Lost Sister. And I want to talk about this one specifically because it's the most controversial episode in the entire series. And it tells you something really important about what the Duffers were trying to do with Eleven's character that I think a lot of people missed. In this episode, Eleven leaves Hawkins to find Kaylee, another girl from the lab who has the power to create illusions. The episode is almost entirely disconnected from the main plot. It takes place in Chicago. The tone is completely different, darker, grittier, more urban. The other characters feel like they belong in a different show entirely, and fans absolutely hated it. It is by far the lowest rated episode of Stranger Things on IMDb. People called it filler. People called it a backdoor pilot for a spin-off nobody wanted. People skipped it on rewatch. But here's what I think most people missed. The entire point of that episode is to show Eleven making a choice. Kaylee represents the path of vengeance, using her powers to hunt down and punish the people who hurt her. It's the angry path, the violent path, the path that feels justified but leads nowhere good. Eleven goes down that road for an episode. She puts on the punk clothes. She practices her angry face. She almost kills a man. And then she stops. She sees a vision of Mike and Hopper, and she chooses to go back. She chooses connection over revenge. She chooses Hawkins over Chicago. She chooses to be 11 instead of becoming another collie. Without that episode, Eleven's return to Hawkins in the Season 2 finale doesn't carry the same weight. She's not just coming back because the plot requires it. She's coming back because she made a conscious decision about who she wants to be. The Lost Sister is the worst episode of Stranger Things by popular consensus, and it might be the most important one for Eleven's character arc. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes the best character work happens in the episodes people like the least. Season 3 strips Eleven of her powers entirely by the end, which is the most interesting thing the show could have done with her at that point. For 3 seasons, her identity has been defined by what she can do. Flip vans, close gates, kill demogorgons. Take that away, and who is she? Season 4 answers that question by sending her back to the lab, back to Brenner, back to the origin of her trauma. And I think the season 4 lab sequences are some of the best storytelling in the entire series because they finally answer the question the show has been dancing around since episode 1. Where did the upside down come from? And the answer is 11. She opened the gate. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but the gate exists because of her. The sorcerer's power created the very threat that the sorcerer has been fighting for 4 seasons. That is phenomenal circular storytelling. It means every monster, every death, every moment of horror in the entire show traces back to one girl in a lab who was pushed too far. And that brings us to season 5, which I think is going to be the most important season for 11, not because of what she does, but because of what she chooses. The Duffers have been building toward a specific question for 4 seasons. Can 11 defeat Vecna without becoming him? Can she use the power that was forced on her for good without losing herself in the process? Can the weapon become a person? That is the arc. That is the entire show, distilled into one character. And I genuinely believe the answer to that question will determine whether Stranger Things is remembered as a great show or one of the greatest shows. But that's a discussion for when season 5 actually airs. And I want to take a moment here to talk about what Millie Bobby Brown actually had to go through physically to play this role across 4 seasons, because I think it gets overlooked. In season 1, she was shaving her head and doing scenes in sensory deprivation tanks filled with salt water. In season 2, she was spending hours in the upside down set, which was, by the crew's own description, a genuinely miserable environment to work in. Cold, dark, covered in artificial vines and slime. In season 3, she was doing the scene where she pulls a piece of the mind flayer out of her own leg. And if you watch that scene closely, Brown's screams are not entirely acting. The practical effects rig they used actually pinched her skin. She was 14 years old, screaming on camera, and part of that scream was real pain. By season 4, Brown was doing some of the most emotionally demanding work of the entire series. The lab flashback sequences where young 11 confronts her past. And here's something the Duffers have talked about that I find really important from a show-running perspective. They said they were very conscious of the fact that they were asking young women to relive fictional trauma every day for months of filming. They hired an on-set therapist. They checked in with Brown regularly. They gave her the power to stop a scene if she felt overwhelmed. This sounds like it should be standard practice in Hollywood. It is not. The fact that the Duffers thought about the psychological impact of their show on their young star says something about the kind of people they are. It also probably contributed to the quality of the performance. An actor who feels safe can go to darker places than an actor who doesn't. Brown has also talked about how growing up on set affected her personally. She started the show at 12. By season 4, she was 18. She went through puberty on camera. She fell in love for the first time. She became one of the most famous teenagers on the planet. And the character she plays went through a parallel version of the same journey. From a scared, silent child to a young woman who has to decide what kind of person she's going to be. When 11 finds her voice over the course of the show, it's hard to separate that from Brown finding hers. The performance and the person grew up together. That kind of synchronicity between actor and character is rare, and it gives the show a depth that purely fictional performances can't replicate. Over the course of Stranger Things history, no character has undergone a more dramatic transformation than 11. And I don't just mean within the show. I mean the actual process of creating her. Because the story of how 11 came to exist is almost as wild as the story of 11 herself. And it starts with a 12-year-old girl from Bournemouth, England, whose acting career was essentially dead before it began. Millie Bobby Brown had been auditioning for everything. Disney Channel shows, small British dramas, background roles, anything her parents could get her in front of a camera for. And she was getting rejected constantly. Her talent agency actually dropped her. Just straight up told her family that it wasn't going to work out, and she should probably consider doing something else with her life. She was 12, and her professional acting career was, by any reasonable measure, already over. Then a pair of twin brothers from Durham, North Carolina, Matt and Ross Duffer, sent out a casting call for a show that nobody wanted. And I mean nobody. The Duffer brothers had been shopping this project around to every network that would take a meeting, and they had been rejected somewhere between 15 and 20 times depending on which interview you read. Every major network passed. The concept, a group of kids in the 1980s fighting interdimensional monsters in a small Indiana town, was considered too niche, too nostalgic, too risky. One executive reportedly told them the show couldn't work because it fell between two audiences, too scary for kids, too kid-focused for adults. And here's the thing that really gets me about this. The show wasn't even called Stranger Things at that point. It was called Montauk. The original setting was Long Island, not Hawkins, Indiana. And the reason it was called Montauk is genuinely unsettling. It was inspired by the Montauk Project, an alleged series of secret government experiments that supposedly took place at Camp Hero in Montauk, New York, during the early 1980s. These experiments allegedly involved kidnapping children and subjecting them to psychological testing, sensory deprivation, and attempts to develop psychic abilities. Sound familiar? The basic plot of Stranger Things: a government lab experimenting on children, one of whom escapes with telekinetic powers, is essentially the Montauk conspiracy theory turned into a television show. The Duffer brothers had to change the location from Long Island to Indiana because filming in Montauk during winter would have been logistically impossible. But the DNA of that conspiracy theory is woven into every frame of the show, so Netflix picks it up. Everybody else said no, Netflix said yes, and thank God they did, because what followed is one of the most successful television shows in the history of the platform. But even after getting greenlit, the casting of 11 was a nightmare. They auditioned roughly 1,000 kids for the role. 1,000. And most of them couldn't do what the Duffers needed, which was to convey enormous emotional depth with almost no dialogue. 11 barely speaks in season 1. She communicates through facial expressions, body language, silence. Finding a child actor who could carry an entire show on her face alone was, as the Duffers have said, the single most important decision they made. Millie Bobby Brown sent in a self-tape audition, and the Duffers have been very clear about this. Within the first 30 seconds, they knew. They knew she was 11. They called her agent, they brought her in, and they offered her the role. The girl, whose career was over at 12 years old, had just been cast as the lead in what would become one of the biggest shows in the world. But then came the head shave. And this is where the story gets really interesting from a character development perspective, because what happened to Millie during the head shave essentially mirrors what happens to 11 as a character. Brown has talked about this openly. When they shaved her head on camera, she cried. Not because she cared about her hair. She's been very clear about that. She cried because in that moment she suddenly felt different from every other kid she knew. She felt isolated. She felt like she didn't belong anymore. And that feeling, that specific painful 12-year-old feeling of being the weird one, the outsider, the girl who doesn't look like anyone else, is exactly what 11 experiences in the show. The isolation of the actress began to mirror the isolation of the character. Whether that was intentional on the Duffers' part or just a fortunate coincidence, it produced one of the most authentic child performances in television history. Now let's talk about how they actually built 11 as a character, because I think there's a really specific structural decision that makes her work so well. and it's something the Duffers clearly borrowed from the Dungeons and Dragons framework that runs through the entire show. From the very first episode, Stranger Things establishes itself as being heavily inspired by D&D. The boys play the game in Mike's basement. The monsters are named after D&D creatures: the Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer, Vecna. And if you look at the main cast through a D&D lens, each character maps onto a specific class. Will is the wizard, the one who gets lost in another dimension. Lucas is the ranger, resourceful, practical, the one who wants to do things by the book. Dustin is the bard. He uses knowledge, charm, and communication to solve problems. And Eleven is the sorcerer, raw, untrained power that she barely understands and can barely control. This D&D framework isn't just a cute Easter egg. It's the structural foundation of the show. And for Eleven specifically, the sorcerer archetype dictates her entire arc across 4 seasons. A sorcerer's power is innate. They don't learn magic from books or training. They're born with it. But that power comes at a cost. It's volatile, it's dangerous, and the sorcerer has to learn to control it or risk destroying themselves and everyone around them. That is Eleven's story. Season 1 through Season 4, every single major plot point in her arc is about the tension between power and control, between what she can do and whether she should do it, between who she was made to be in the lab and who she chooses to be outside of it. And the D&D parallels go deeper than just character classes. The Duffers have said in interviews that they structure each season's threat like a D&D campaign. The Demogorgon in Season 1 is a monster encounter. Straightforward, terrifying, kill or be killed. The Mind Flayer in Season 2 is a Dungeon Master level threat, an intelligence that controls lesser creatures and manipulates the environment. Vecna in Season 4 is literally named after a D&D deity. The Archlich, the god of secrets, the undead sorcerer who rules through knowledge and fear. The show's villains escalate the way D&D encounters escalate, from creature to intelligence to god. And if you extend that logic to Season 5, the final boss should be something beyond even a god, which is a terrifying thing to contemplate. The boys' D&D campaigns in the show also function as foreshadowing for each season's plot. In the Season 1 premiere, the boys are fighting the Demogorgon in a campaign when Will rolls a 7, a bad roll, and loses the fight. Then Will goes missing in real life. The fictional game predicted the real story. In Season 2, the boys discuss the Mind Flayer in a campaign before they encounter it in reality. In Season 4, Eddie's Hellfire Club campaign against Vecna precedes the actual confrontation with Vecna. Every season opens with a D&D game that tells you what the season will be about. The boys are literally playing their own futures and don't know it. Now, let's shift gears and talk about a completely different kind of character evolution. One that wasn't planned at all. Because over the course of Stranger Things history, no character transformation has been more unplanned, more accidental, and more beloved than what happened to Steve Harrington. In the original plan for Season 1, Steve Harrington was supposed to die. That's not speculation. The Duffers have confirmed this in multiple interviews. Steve was written as a one-dimensional bully, the popular kid, the guy who dates Nancy, treats her poorly, spray paints slurs about her on the movie theater marquee, and then gets killed by the Demogorgon in the finale. That was the plan. Steve was cannon fodder with good hair. And then Joe Keery showed up and ruined everything. In the best possible way. Keery's audition was so charming, so naturally likable, that the Duffers started rewriting the character mid-season. They couldn't kill this guy. The audience would hate them for it. So instead of dying, Steve picks up a baseball bat wrapped in nails and fights the Demogorgon alongside Jonathan and Nancy. He goes from bully to hero in the span of about 20 minutes of screen time. It is one of the most abrupt character pivots in modern television, and it works entirely because of the actor. The writing didn't change Steve, Joe Keery changed Steve. The Duffers just had the good sense to follow his lead. And I want to pause here and talk about why this specific kind of character rescue is so rare in television. Most shows plan their arcs years in advance. Characters have trajectories that are mapped out before the first episode airs. When a character is scheduled to die, they die. The show has already been written around their absence. What the Duffers did with Steve is the equivalent of an architect looking at a building mid-construction and saying, "Actually, let's move that wall and add a whole new wing." And somehow the building comes out better for it. That takes confidence. It also takes a kind of creative humility that most showrunners don't have, which is the willingness to admit that your original plan was wrong and the actor's instinct was right. Season 2 is where things get really interesting because this is where the Duffers figure out what to actually do with a character they accidentally kept alive. And the answer is so simple and so perfect that it feels like it was planned all along. They pair him with Dustin. The Steve-Dustin dynamic was not in the original Season 2 outline. It emerged during the writing process when the Duffers realized they had two characters who needed something from each other. Dustin needed a cool older friend, and Steve needed a reason to care about something other than his own popularity. The result is one of the most beloved relationships in the entire show, and it changed Steve's trajectory permanently. Steve goes from King Steve to Babysitter Steve to what fans have affectionately called Mom Steve. He becomes the protector of children he has no biological connection to. He gives them advice. He drives them around. He fights interdimensional monsters to keep them safe. The jock becomes the caretaker. And I think the reason this works so well, the reason fans responded to it so intensely, is because it feels real. In real life, the coolest thing a popular kid can do is be kind to the unpopular kids. That's it. That's the whole trick. Steve figured it out. It just took a Demogorgon to get him there. Season 3 leans fully into this new Steve by pairing him with Robin, giving him a job at Scoops Ahoy, and essentially turning him into a comedy character. And here's something I find fascinating about the Robin relationship. When Maya Hawke was cast, the original plan was for Steve and Robin to become a romantic couple. But during rehearsals, Hawke and the Duffers realized something wasn't working. The chemistry between Steve and Robin felt like friendship, not romance. So they rewrote Robin's coming out scene in the bathroom, the one where she tells Steve she's gay, and it became one of the most emotionally honest moments in the entire season. Steve's reaction is perfect. He doesn't make it about himself. He doesn't sulk. He just accepts it, moves on, and their friendship becomes stronger for it. That scene was rewritten because the actors and the showrunners trusted what the characters were telling them, instead of forcing a predetermined arc. That's good writing. That's also the exact same instinct that saved Steve from dying in Season 1. Listen to the character, not the outline. And this leads into something I think is really important about how Stranger Things handles Steve in Season 4. By this point, Steve has become such a beloved character that the show has a problem. The audience is more invested in Steve's survival than in almost any other characters, which means the Duffers can use that investment as a weapon. Every time Steve is in danger in Season 4, the bat attack in the Upside Down, the underwater portal, the fight with Vecna's creatures, the audience is terrified not because the threat is particularly scary, but because it's aimed at someone they cannot afford to lose. The Duffers understand this. They put Steve in danger constantly in Season 4 specifically because they know the audience will react. It's a manipulation, and it works. And it's the direct result of the decision they made in season 1 to keep him alive. One creative choice made on instinct, creating ripple effects 4 seasons later. There's also a subtle detail about Steve's character that I don't think gets discussed enough. Steve never gets better at fighting. Seriously, go back and watch. In season 1, he fights the Demogorgon with a bat and gets knocked around. In season 2, he fights Billy and gets his face smashed in with a plate. In season 3, he gets beaten up by the Russian soldier. In season 4, he gets attacked by bats and nearly drowns. Steve Harrington has been in 4 seasons of Stranger Things and has won approximately 0 fights. He is the worst fighter in the show. And yet he keeps showing up. He keeps grabbing the bat. He keeps putting himself between the monsters and the kids. He loses every time and he never stops trying. That is heroism, not winning, showing up anyway. Joe Keery's hair, by the way, became its own cultural phenomenon. The production team has talked about this. Keery's hair was so voluminous, so perfectly coiffed, so aggressively 1980s that it essentially became a character unto itself. There were Reddit threads dedicated to analyzing his hair products. Dustin's obsession with Steve's hair in the show is a direct reference to the real-world obsession. The Duffers wrote it in because it was already happening in the fandom. Sometimes the best writing is just paying attention to what your audience is already doing and reflecting it back at them. But I think the most important thing about Steve's evolution, the thing that makes it genuinely meaningful beyond just being a fun character arc, is what it says about the nature of heroism in Stranger Things. In this show, the traditional hero archetypes don't work. Jonathan should be the hero. He's the brave older brother searching for his missing sibling. But Jonathan's arc stalls out around season 3. Hopper should be the hero. He's the grizzled cop with a tragic past. But Hopper gets sidelined to Russia for an entire season. Even Eleven, the most powerful character in the show, spends significant portions of each season either powerless or isolated. Steve is none of these things. He has no powers. He has no tragic origin story. He has no special training. He's just a guy with a bat who shows up when things get bad. And that's why he resonates. In a show full of psychic children and interdimensional portals and shadow monsters, the most beloved character is the normal dude who keeps volunteering to get his ass kicked because someone has to. That's not a planned character arc. That's an accident that became the heart of the show. And speaking of accidental fan favorites, we need to talk about Eddie Munson. Because Eddie's arc in season 4 is in many ways a compressed, accelerated version of what happened to Steve, except with a much darker ending. Eddie was introduced in season 4 as the leader of the Hellfire Club, the school's D&D group. He's loud, weird, theatrical, the kind of kid who stands on lunch tables and makes speeches about conformity. He is, by every metric that matters in a 1980s high school, a freak. And when Vecna kills Chrissy Cunningham in Eddie's trailer, Eddie becomes the town's prime suspect. The metalhead D&D kid who everyone already thought was dangerous becomes the most wanted man in Hawkins. The town turns on him instantly, because of course it does. He was already an outsider. The accusation just confirmed what they already believed. What makes Eddie's story so effective and so painful is that it mirrors a very real phenomenon from the 1980s, the Satanic Panic. During the early and mid-80s, there was a genuine, widespread moral panic in America about Dungeons and Dragons, heavy metal music, and their supposed connection to Satanism and violence. Kids who played D&D were accused of being devil worshippers. Parents burned their children's game books. The show Stranger Things had been referencing this cultural moment since season 1, but season 4 puts it front and center through Eddie. He's not just a character. He's a stand-in for every weird kid who was blamed for something they didn't do because the adults in their lives needed someone to be afraid of. And then Eddie dies. He sacrifices himself in the Upside Down, playing guitar to draw the bats away from Dustin, buying time for the others to fight Vecna. His final words to Dustin, "I didn't run away this time, right?" are devastating because they reveal what Eddie was really afraid of. Not the monsters, not the Upside Down. He was afraid of being a coward. He ran when Chrissy died, not because he's a bad person, but because he was terrified and it was a human reaction. And his entire arc in season 4 is about proving to himself that he's not the person who runs. He proves it, and it kills him. The parallels to Steve are obvious. Steve was the popular kid who became a hero by accident. Eddie was the unpopular kid who became a hero by choice. Steve lived. Eddie didn't. And the reason Eddie's death hit fans so hard is precisely because Steve lived. The show established a precedent that outcasts can be redeemed and survive, and then it broke that precedent with Eddie. The Duffers gave us hope and then took it away, which is, if we're being honest, exactly what good storytelling is supposed to do. Joseph Quinn's audition for Eddie was apparently so electric that the Duffers expanded the role significantly from what was originally written. Sound familiar? It's the exact same thing that happened with Joe Keery and Steve. The Duffers keep writing disposable characters, casting actors who are too good for the role, and then rewriting the show around them. At this point, it's basically their creative method. Write a character to die, cast someone incredible, and then figure out what to do with the problem you've created. Sometimes the answer is keep them alive. Sometimes it's give them the most heroic death in the series. Either way, the instinct to follow the actor instead of the outline is what makes this show work. All right, now let's talk about the villain side of things, because if Steve represents the most unplanned transformation in Stranger Things, then Vecna represents the most meticulously planned one. And I've been wanting to do a deep breakdown of the Vecna reveal for a while now, because I genuinely think it's one of the most impressive pieces of long-term storytelling in modern television. So Vecna. Let's start with what makes this villain work so well compared to the previous antagonists in the series, because I think there's a pretty clear pattern in how Stranger Things escalates its villains that mirrors a lot of what we see in classic D&D campaigns. Season 1 gives us the Demogorgon. It's a monster, pure and simple. It doesn't talk. It doesn't think in any way we can understand. It's a predator. It hunts. It kills. It's terrifying because it's unknowable. You can't reason with it. You can't negotiate with it. You can barely look at it without your brain trying to reject what it's seeing. The Demogorgon works perfectly for Season 1 because the show is essentially a horror movie stretched into 8 episodes. And in a horror movie, the less you understand about the monster, the scarier it is. Season 2 gives us the Mind Flayer. Now we've escalated from a predator to an intelligence. The Mind Flayer doesn't just hunt. It possesses, it controls, it has a plan. It uses will as a spy. It coordinates the Demo Dogs. It's playing a longer game than the Demogorgon ever could. The Mind Flayer is scarier because it's smarter, and in the D&D framework, it maps perfectly onto its namesake. The Mind Flayer in D&D is a psychic entity that controls lesser creatures through a hive mind. Same deal here. Season 3 brings the Mind Flayer into the physical world as this massive shadow creature which is visually spectacular. But I think most people would agree the Mind Flayer never quite achieved the same level of personal threat as the Demogorgon did. It's big and scary, but it's also kind of abstract. You can't have a conversation with a shadow cloud. And then Season 4 gives us Vecna, and everything changes. Because Vecna is a person. He has a name. He has a backstory. He has motivations you can understand even if you find them horrifying. He was a child in the lab. He was number one. He was Henry Creel. He killed his own family. He was banished to the Upside Down by 11 and spent years building himself into the entity we see in Season 4. Every single villain in the show up to this point, the Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer, the Demo Dogs, all of it was connected to him. He was the spider at the center of the web all along. Now here's what I think is genuinely brilliant about the Vecna reveal and what I want to spend some time on. The Duffers didn't just invent Vecna for Season 4. They seeded his existence across the previous 3 seasons in ways that most viewers didn't notice until the reveal recontextualized everything. Clock imagery appears as early as Season 2. Spider imagery shows up repeatedly. The Mind Flayer, which we assumed was the big bad, the ultimate threat, the final boss of the show, turns out to be a tool that Vecna created and controls. That completely reframes every previous season. The entity that possessed Will, the shadow that terrorized Hawkins, the force behind every monster in the show. It was all one guy. One angry, traumatized kid from the lab who decided the world deserved to burn. And this is why Vecna works so much better than any previous villain. You can't have a conversation with a Demogorgon. You can't understand why the Mind Flayer does what it does. But Vecna tells you exactly why. He sits across from his victims and explains himself. He's not a force of nature, he's a person who made choices. Bad choices, horrifying choices, but choices nonetheless. And that makes him infinitely more terrifying than any shadow monster, because it means the greatest threat in Stranger Things isn't from another dimension. It's human. It's always been human. Jamie Campbell Bower's casting as Vecna was kept secret even from most of the cast. He auditioned under a fake character name. When the Season 4 reveal happened, the moment where the friendly orderly is revealed to be one, who is revealed to be Henry Creel, who is revealed to be Vecna. Multiple cast members have said that they were genuinely shocked. Millie Bobby Brown reportedly had the same reaction as the audience. She didn't know. The Duffers kept the secret so tight that the performance you see from 11 in that reveal scene contains real surprise. The prosthetics for Vecna took over 7 hours to apply each day. Bower would arrive on set at 3 in the morning and not be camera ready until mid-morning. The suit was full practical. No CGI face, no motion capture. Every crack, every tendril, every piece of exposed muscle is physical prosthetics applied piece by piece. When you look at Vecna on screen, you're looking at a real person under 8 pounds of silicone and latex. Bower has talked about how the prosthetics changed his performance. The weight of the suit, the restricted movement, the inability to make normal facial expressions, all of it forced him into a different physical vocabulary. Vecna moves slowly, not just because it's creepy, but because Bower literally couldn't move fast in that suit. The limitation became the character. And I think the thing that really elevates Vecna beyond just being a cool villain is how the show uses him as a mirror for 11. They're the same. Both were children in the lab. Both have powers. Both were shaped by Brenner. The difference is that 11 found connection. Mike, the boys, Hopper, Joyce, and Henry found nothing. Nobody reached out to him. Nobody gave him egos. Nobody taught him what a friend was. And so his power curdled into something destructive instead of something protective. 11 and Vecna are the answer to the same question. What happens when you give a child enormous power? Answered in 2 completely opposite ways. One became a hero, the other became a god of the Upside Down. And the only difference between them is that one of them had friends. That's beautiful storytelling. And it ties directly back to the show's most important line. Friends don't lie. It's not just a cute catchphrase, it's the thesis of the entire series. Connection saves you. Isolation destroys you. 11 had friends. Vecna didn't. Everything that follows is a consequence of that single difference. And I want to get specific about the foreshadowing for a second, because the Duffers buried so much of Vecna's existence in the previous seasons that it's genuinely impressive once you start cataloging it. Clocks. Clock imagery shows up as early as Season 2 in subtle background details. The grandfather clock that Vecna uses as his signature, the sound his victims hear before he takes them, appears in various forms throughout Seasons 2 and 3 if you know where to look. Whether the Duffers had Vecna fully planned that early is debatable, but the imagery is there. It's either incredible foresight or incredibly convenient coincidence. Either way, it works. Spiders. Henry Creel had an obsession with spiders as a child. He studied them. He admired them. He saw them as the perfect predators, patient, methodical, building webs, and waiting for prey to come to them. And if you go back and watch the previous seasons, spider imagery appears in places you'd never think to look. The Mind Flayer's shape, that massive shadow creature in Season 2, has been compared to a spider by fans. And while that might be a stretch, the connection between Vecna's childhood fascination and the Mind Flayer's form is hard to ignore once you know they're connected. The Upside Down itself. For 3 seasons, we're told that the Upside Down is an alternate dimension, a dark mirror of our world that existed before the gate was opened. Season 4 complicates this. It suggests that the Upside Down might not have existed in its current form until 11 sent Henry there. That the dimension might have been shaped by Henry's mind, his rage, his pain, his hatred of the world above. If that's true, then the Upside Down isn't just a place. It's a projection, a physical manifestation of one person's trauma, made real and given teeth. The monsters aren't random. They're expressions of a broken child's anger, grown monstrous over decades of isolation. That is a profoundly dark idea, and it retroactively changes the meaning of every monster encounter in the entire series. The Demogorgon wasn't just a predator, it was an extension of Henry's will. The Mind Flayer wasn't just an alien intelligence, it was a tool Henry built to control the dimension he was trapped in. Every death, every possession, every moment of horror, they all trace back to one kid in a lab who was too smart, too powerful, and too alone. I think this is the single most important reveal in Stranger Things history. Not because it's the most surprising. The twist itself is well executed, but follows a pattern we've seen in other shows. What makes it important is what it means thematically. The biggest threat in Stranger Things is not from another dimension. It's from this one. It's human. And it was created by the same institution, Hawkins Lab, that created 11. The hero and the villain came from the same place. The only difference is that one of them was shown kindness and the other wasn't. Now, while we're talking about Season 4, we absolutely have to talk about the episode that broke the internet and resurrected a 40-year-old song from the dead. Season 4, Episode 4, Dear Billy, is the episode where Max Mayfield is trapped in Vecna's curse. And the only thing that can save her is her favorite song, Running Up That Hill, by Kate Bush. I want to break down why this scene works so well, because I think it's actually a masterclass in how to earn an emotional payoff. Throughout Season 4, Max has been dealing with grief and survivor's guilt over Billy's death. She's isolating herself from her friends. She's writing letters she never sends. She's doing all the things that make a person vulnerable to Vecna, because Vecna feeds on trauma and isolation. So when Vecna takes her, it doesn't feel random. It feels inevitable. The show has been building toward this moment for episodes. The rescue sequence is built around the idea that music, specifically a song that is deeply personally meaningful to the victim, can pull someone out of Vecna's trance. Dustin, Lucas, and Steve figure this out. They get Max's Walkman, they press play, and Running Up That Hill starts. What happens next is one of the most affecting scenes in the history of the show. Max runs. She runs through the upside down toward a light that represents her friends' voices, her connection to the real world, her reason to live. The song builds, the editing accelerates, and she breaks free. She falls out of the trance and into Lucas's arms, and she's alive, and the audience collectively loses its mind. The reason it works is not the song. The song is great. Kate Bush is a genius, obviously, but the scene would work with any song that carried the same emotional weight for the character. The reason it works is because the show earned it. 4 episodes of Max grieving, isolating, pulling away from the people who love her, and then one moment where those people pull her back. The music isn't the weapon. The connection is the weapon. The music is just the delivery system. Now here's the part of this story that genuinely blows my mind. Running Up That Hill was released in 1985. It was a hit at the time, reached number 3 in the UK. But by 2022, it had faded into the category of songs your parents might know. Kate Bush hadn't released new music in over a decade. She was essentially retired. After Dear Billy aired, Running Up That Hill went to number 1 on the charts. Not in the UK, worldwide. It hit number 1 in multiple countries simultaneously, 37 years after its original release. It broke the record for the longest time between initial release and reaching number 1. Kate Bush reportedly earned over $2 million in streaming royalties in a single month. She went from semi-retired obscurity to the most streamed artist on the planet. Because a fictional teenager needed a song to survive a psychic attack, Bush herself said she was overwhelmed by the resurgence. She had not given the Duffer Brothers permission to use the song in advance. They had to negotiate the rights while the show was already in production. Bush has historically been very protective of her music and rarely licenses it for television or film. She made an exception for Stranger Things. Whether she knew how massive the impact would be is unclear. But the result is one of the most extraordinary examples of a television show directly altering the real-world cultural conversation. Stranger Things didn't just reference 80s culture, it brought part of it back to life. And this is actually a pattern with the show. The entire aesthetic of Stranger Things, the synth soundtrack, the Spielberg-era visual style, the D&D references, the Cold War paranoia, created a cultural feedback loop where 80s nostalgia went from niche to mainstream. D&D sales increased after season 1 aired. Synthesizer sales spiked. Halloween costume sales for Eleven's pink dress and buzz cut exploded. The show didn't just mine 80s culture for content, it reactivated it. But here's what I think is the most underappreciated thing about Stranger Things' relationship with music. It's not just running up that hill. The show has consistently used music as a character tool in ways that most shows don't even attempt. In season 1, Should I Stay or Should I Go by The Clash isn't just a song Will likes. It's a communication device, a connection between Jonathan and Will that transcends dimensions. In season 3, the score shifts to a more synthwave sound that mirrors the neon-drenched mall-centric aesthetic of the season. In season 4, the idea that music can literally save your life from a psychic attack became a plot device that also happened to be scientifically adjacent. There is real research suggesting that music activates parts of the brain that trauma responses suppress. The Duffers have talked about how they build playlists for each character before they start writing a season. Eleven's playlist, Max's playlist, Steve's playlist. The music informs the writing, not the other way around. They figure out what a character listens to, and that helps them figure out who the character is. It's a backwards approach. Most shows write the character first and add music later. But it works because music is emotional shorthand. If you know someone's playlist, you know their heart. The Duffers use that principle as a writing tool. And this leads me to something I think about a lot when it comes to Stranger Things, the show's relationship with nostalgia. Because I think there's a real danger in nostalgia-driven storytelling. And I think Stranger Things navigates that danger better than almost any other show I can think of. The danger is that nostalgia becomes a substitute for substance. You reference E.T., you play an 80s song, you put kids on bikes, and you think, that's enough. It's not. References without meaning are just trivia. And Stranger Things, at its best, uses nostalgia not as decoration, but as architecture. The 80s setting isn't just an aesthetic choice, it's a narrative choice. The Cold War paranoia that drives the government conspiracy plot makes sense in the 80s. The satanic panic that turns Hawkins against Eddie makes sense in the 80s. The isolation of a small town where nobody believes in monsters makes sense in a pre-internet world where information doesn't travel and kids have to solve their own problems because nobody else will. Take away the 80s setting and Stranger Things doesn't work. Not because the reference would be lost, but because the story wouldn't make sense. That's the difference between nostalgia as wallpaper and nostalgia as foundation. The Duffers built on the foundation, and that's why the show holds up on rewatch in a way that most nostalgia-driven content doesn't. I also want to talk about something the show does that I think is genuinely interesting, and that's how it handles the passage of time. Stranger Things has a problem. Most shows don't. Its child actors are aging in real time. The actors who were 12 in season 1 are in their 20s now. The show is set in the 1980s, but it's been made across a decade of real time. And the Duffers have had to account for the fact that their kids are growing up faster than the show's timeline allows. They've handled this by compressing the timeline. All 4 seasons cover only about 2.5 years of in-universe time, from November 1983 to March 1986. That's tight for a show that aired across 8 years. They've also allowed the show to mature alongside its actors. Season 1 feels like a kids' show with horror elements. Season 4 feels like a horror show with kid elements. The tonal shift mirrors the fact that the actors and the audience have grown up together. Harry Potter did this with its films. Stranger Things is doing it with its seasons. And Season 5 is the ultimate test. The kids are now adults, and the show has to decide whether to treat them as the children they were or the adults they've become. The Duffers have said Season 5 will acknowledge this. Whether they can pull it off will determine the show's legacy. Speaking of Season 5, a few things worth noting about what we can reasonably predict. Vecna is weakened but alive. Max is in a coma. Hawkins has been physically torn open. Will can still sense Vecna. The Duffers have said Season 5 will be 8 episodes and will move fast, like the final session of a D&D campaign where the party faces the ultimate boss. The question everyone is asking is who dies. Without speculating too heavily, I think the show has given us enough foreshadowing to notice some patterns. Hopper already had a fake-out death. Doing it again would feel cheap. Max is already in a coma. Killing her now would feel redundant. The characters most likely in real danger are those who've completed their arcs, Steve, whose redemption is total, Jonathan, whose story has stalled, and Eleven herself, whose journey has been building toward a confrontation that might cost everything. The Duffers have compared Eleven to Jean Grey from X-Men, a powerful telepath who dies and is reborn through her connection to the Phoenix Force. If the show pulls a death and rebirth, it would fit both the narrative and the D&D framework. In D&D, resurrection is possible. But there's always a cost. Whatever happens, the level of care the Duffers bring to these characters is visible in every frame. They didn't kill Steve because they loved what Kiri brought. They kept Bob alive 4 extra episodes because Sean Astin was too good to lose sooner. They gave Max a favorite song that saved a fictional life and a real singer's career. They hid a blue hairband across 4 seasons because someone might notice and find it beautiful. That care is rare, and it's why the show works. Now, before we get into the production side of things, I want to talk about 2 more characters. One who has too much screen time to be ignored, and one who has almost none, but somehow became more famous than half the living cast. Let's start with Hopper, because Hopper's arc across the series is one of those slow burn transformations that you don't fully appreciate until you step back and look at the whole picture. In season 1, Hopper is introduced as a broken man, divorced, drinking, popping pills in the morning to get through the day. His daughter Sarah died of cancer, and that loss broke something in him that he's been trying to numb ever since. When Will goes missing, Hopper initially treats it like any other missing kid case. He's going through the motions. But as the investigation pulls him deeper into the conspiracy around Hawkins' lab, something wakes up in him. Not heroism exactly, more like purpose. He has a reason to get out of bed that isn't just habit. By season 2, Hopper has adopted 11. And this is where the show does something really smart with his character. Hopper's instinct is to protect 11 by hiding her, keeping her in the cabin, keeping her away from the world, keeping her safe. But safe and happy aren't the same thing, and 11 knows it. The conflict between Hopper's desire to protect and 11's desire to live is the emotional core of season 2. It's also a very specific kind of parent-child dynamic. The overprotective father who loves so hard that it feels like a cage. Hopper isn't wrong to be afraid. The people who took 11 from the lab would take her again if they found her. But he's also not right to keep her locked in a cabin, counting the days on a calendar and waiting for soon to become now. The 3-inch rule, the door has to stay open at least 3 inches, is the compromise. It's Hopper's way of saying, I can't give you freedom, but I can give you air. And it's 11's way of accepting a boundary while quietly resenting it. That 3-inch gap is the entire relationship in a single physical detail. Season 3 kills Hopper. Season 4 reveals he's alive in a Russian prison. And I have mixed feelings about this, honestly. On one hand, the fake-out death cheapened the Season 3 finale retroactively. On the other hand, David Harbour's performance in the Russian prison sequences is some of his best work. Hopper stripped of everything, no badge, no gun, no cabin, no 11, is Hopper reduced to his essential self. And his essential self turns out to be a man who will fight a Demogorgon with a sword in a Russian arena. Because that's just who he is. Not because it's smart, not because it's a plan, because something needs killing, and he's the closest person with a weapon. That's Hopper. A man who runs toward danger not because he's brave, but because he can't help it. The reunion between Hopper and 11 in the Season 4 finale is one of the most emotional moments in the series. And it's earned because the show spent 4 seasons building toward it. 4 seasons of a man learning to be a father and a girl learning to let herself be someone's daughter. The hug at the end of Season 4 contains 4 seasons of context. You're not watching 2 actors embrace. You're watching 2 characters who almost lost each other and now understand what they are to each other. And then there's Barb. I need to talk about Barb because what happened with Barb is one of the strangest phenomena in the history of television fandom. And it tells you something really important about how audiences attach to characters in ways that creators never anticipate. Barbara Holland appears in 3 episodes of Stranger Things Season 1. She has maybe 15 minutes of total screen time. She is Nancy's best friend. She goes to a pool party. She sits on the diving board alone while Nancy goes upstairs with Steve, and the Demogorgon takes her. She dies off screen. Her body is found later in the Upside Down, covered in vines with a slug crawling out of her mouth. That's it. That's her entire arc. 15 minutes, a pool, a monster, done. And the internet lost its mind. Hash Justice for Barb became one of the first major fan campaigns of the streaming era. Fans were furious, not because Barb was a deep character with an unfinished arc, but because she represented something specific. She was the friend who gets left behind, the one who sits alone at the party while everyone else is having fun, the one who does the responsible thing and dies for it while the irresponsible people survive. Every person who has ever been the Barb in a social situation, the one waiting by the car, the one checking their phone, the one who didn't want to come but came anyway because their friend asked, felt her death personally. Shannon Purser, the actress who played Barb, went from complete unknown to Emmy nominee in less than a year. She was nominated for Outstanding Guest Actress in a Drama Series for what amounts to about 15 minutes of screen time across 3 episodes. The nomination was driven almost entirely by fan pressure. The Academy doesn't normally notice guest roles in genre television. They notice Barb because the audience refused to let them ignore her. The Duffers have admitted they were completely blindsided by the Barb reaction. They wrote her as a minor character whose death serves Nancy's arc, motivating Nancy to investigate the Upside Down. They did not expect Barb to become a cultural icon. In Season 2, they added a storyline specifically addressing Barb's death and the cover-up surrounding it. Murray Baxter helps Nancy and Jonathan expose the truth about what happened to Barb. This entire subplot exists because fans demanded it. The audience literally rewrote the show through the force of their emotional attachment to a character who was on screen for 15 minutes. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about Stranger Things as a cultural phenomenon. The show creates characters that matter more than their screen time justifies. Barb, Bob, Eddie, Alexei, the Russian scientist from Season 3 who loves Slurpees and cherry flavoring, who has maybe 20 minutes of screen time total, and whose death prompted its own wave of fan grief. These are characters who, by any rational analysis, shouldn't matter this much. They're minor, they're brief, they're designed to serve a function and move on, but they matter because the show makes them feel real. Barb feels real because she acts the way a real friend would act at a party full of people she doesn't know. Bob feels real because he's genuinely nice in a world where niceness gets you killed. Eddie feels real because he's loud and weird and theatrical in a way that every outsider kid recognizes. Alexei feels real because he likes cherry Slurpees. And that's such a specific human detail that your brain accepts him as a person rather than a plot device. The Duffers didn't plan for any of these characters to become beloved. They just wrote them honestly. And it turns out that honest writing creates attachment whether you intend it to or not. All right, let's shift into some of the production side of things because I think the behind-the-scenes story of Stranger Things is just as interesting as anything that happens on screen. And there are some details about how the show was made that I think a lot of people don't know about. We already talked about the Montauk origins and the Duffer brothers' rejections, but I want to zoom in on a few specific production details that I find really fascinating. First, the budget escalation. Season 1 of Stranger Things cost roughly $6 million per episode. That is a lot of money for a show nobody had heard of from 2 creators with almost no track record. Netflix took a massive risk. By By season 4, the budget had climbed to approximately $30 million per episode. That is a 5-fold increase over 4 seasons. For context, that puts season 4 of Stranger Things in the same budget range as the final seasons of Game of Thrones. A show about kids in Indiana fighting monsters was costing as much to produce as a show about dragons and medieval warfare. The scope had gotten that big. Second, Sean Astin as Bob Newby. Bob was originally supposed to die in episode 4 of season 2. He was a minor character, Joyce's new boyfriend, a sweet guy destined to be eaten by demo dogs fairly early in the season. But Astin's performance was so warm, so genuine, so lovable, that the Duffers couldn't bring themselves to kill him off that quickly. They kept him alive until episode 8, giving him one of the most heroic and devastating death scenes in the entire series. And here's the really dark alternate version. In an earlier draft, Will was going to kill Bob. The Mind Flayer would have used Will to take Bob out, making the death even more tragic by turning it into a betrayal from within the family. The Duffers ultimately decided that was too dark even for Stranger Things, which is saying something. Third, the casting of David Harbour as Hopper. Harbour has been open about the fact that he was struggling with depression and career frustration when he got the role. He had been working steadily, but hadn't had a breakout part. Stranger Things changed his life in a way that mirrors how the show changes its characters. Someone who felt stuck and purposeless found something worth fighting for. The parallel between Harbour's real-life experience and Hopper's arc in the show. A broken man who finds meaning through protecting a child who isn't his is almost uncomfortably close. Harbour has acknowledged this. He said that playing Hopper helped him process some of his own issues. Whether that makes the performance better or just more personal is a question I'm not qualified to answer, but I think you can feel it in the show. Hopper's pain is too specific to be entirely fictional. Fourth, and this one doesn't get talked about enough, the show's approach to practical effects versus CGI shifted dramatically across seasons. In season 1, the Demogorgon was achieved with a combination of a practical suit and CGI enhancement. The face opening effect was digital, but the body movements were performed by a person in a suit. By season 4, the balance had shifted heavily toward CGI for the creatures, but Vecna remained almost entirely practical. The Duffers made a deliberate choice to keep their main villain physical, something an actor was wearing, something that existed in the room with the other performers. And I think this matters more than people realize, because the difference between acting opposite a tennis ball on a stick and acting opposite Jamie Campbell Bower in 8 pounds of prosthetics is the difference between imagining fear and feeling it. The cast has been very clear about this. Scenes with Vecna were genuinely unsettling to film because there was an actual person standing there looking like that. Fifth, the Duffer Brothers' working method is unusual for showrunners at this level. They direct every premiere and finale themselves. They're present on set for virtually every scene in every episode, even the ones they don't direct. They review every single take. They give notes to every actor in every scene. This level of involvement is exhausting and rare. Most showrunners of shows this big delegate heavily and focus on the writing. The Duffers don't delegate. They're control freaks in the best possible sense, and you can feel that consistency in the show. Stranger Things has a unified visual and tonal identity that doesn't waver across episodes the way many multi-director shows do. Sixth, Winona Ryder. I think Ryder's casting is underappreciated from a historical perspective. When the Duffers cast her, Ryder was in the middle of a career resurgence but was still primarily known for her work in the 80s and 90s. Beetlejuice, Heathers, Edward Scissorhands, Reality Bites. Casting her in a show about 80s nostalgia was a metatextual choice. She doesn't just play Joyce Byers, she embodies the era the show is homaging. When you see Winona Ryder on screen in Stranger Things, part of your brain registers her as a time traveler from the actual 1980s who accidentally wandered onto the set of a show about the 1980s. That casting choice does more work than any production design or vintage prop ever could. And Ryder's performance as Joyce is genuinely one of the most committed things in the show. The Christmas light scene in season 1, where Joyce strings up an alphabet on the wall and communicates with Will through flickering bulbs, was largely improvised in its emotional beats. Ryder decided in the moment how frantic Joyce would be, how desperate, how close to the edge. The Duffers gave her the scene and she made it hers. It became one of the most iconic moments in season 1. And it works because Ryder committed to Joyce's panic so completely that it stops feeling like acting and starts feeling like surveillance footage of a mother losing her mind. And then there are the small details. The details that the production team buried in the background of shots that you would never notice unless someone pointed them out. Hopper's daughter Sarah wore a blue hairband. After Sarah died, Hopper started wearing the same blue band on his wrist. When he took Eleven in, he gave the band to her. It appears throughout the series in different locations: on Hopper's wrist, on Eleven's wrist, in Hopper's cabin. It is never mentioned in dialogue. It is never called out. It just exists, moving from person to person, connecting a dead daughter to a found one through a piece of elastic and cloth that most viewers never consciously notice. In season 3, at the very end, the hair team gave Eleven the same green scrunchie that Max wore earlier in the season. It's a parting gift, a small, wordless gesture of friendship between two girls who spent the season becoming close. Again, never mentioned in dialogue, just there, in the frame, waiting for someone to notice. In season 1, there is a solved Rubik's Cube visible in the background of Mike's room. It's a blink and you miss it detail, but it tells you something about Mike. Only about 5% of people can solve a Rubik's Cube, and Mike apparently is one of them. It's not plot relevant. It's character relevant. It's the kind of detail that makes a fictional bedroom feel like a real one. In season 3, episode 5, Steve beats up a Russian comms officer with a telephone shaped like an ice cream cone. Something he would have been very used to handling from his job at Scoops Ahoy. In season 4, the patient room number for a character in the lab is 403, which is the HTTP status code for forbidden. In season 1, the shed where Will hides has an upside-down horseshoe above the door, traditionally a symbol of bad luck. In season 2, when Eleven's mother turns the TV to channel 8, Eleven leaves to find her sister, who turns out to be number 8. None of these details change the plot. All of them change the texture. They make the world feel considered. They reward attention. And in a show designed to be rewatched, which Stranger Things absolutely is given its mystery structure, these details function like buried treasure. Every rewatch reveals something new. Every background contains a clue or a joke or a reference that someone on the production team put there because they cared enough to hide something beautiful in a place where almost nobody would find it. There are a few more I want to mention because they're my favorites. In season 1, episode 3, when Nancy asks Allie if she's seen Barb, there's a poster visible in the background that reads, "The Raven, Nevermore." That's Edgar Allan Poe, Death and Loss, the Raven's answer to every question. The poster is foreshadowing Barb's death. She will never come back. Nevermore. It's right there on the wall and nobody sees it until after the fact. In season 2, when Bob tells Will about being haunted by a clown as a child, Bob grew up in the late 1950s in Maine. Same state, same era as Stephen King's It. The Duffers weren't just making a cute reference. Bob was essentially a character in It before he was a character in Stranger Things. And then he got killed by something from another dimension, which is about as Stephen King as you can get. In Season 2, Episode 7, Eleven's mother turns the TV to Channel 8 right before Eleven leaves to find her sister. Her sister's designation from the lab is number 8. The TV told you where Eleven was going before Eleven knew. There's a phone number visible in Season 4 that you could actually call. When you dial it, you hear static, typing sounds, and ambient noise from what sounds like a government lab. The production team set up a real working phone number for a fictional government facility. That is an absurd level of commitment. And in Season 4, Lucas reads The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub to Max in her coma. If you pause and look at the cover, the author names stacked on top of each other, the color scheme, the oversized end letters, it looks almost identical to the Stranger Things logo. The show that was inspired by Stephen King is putting a Stephen King book on screen, whose cover looks like the show's logo. References reflecting references all the way down. And I think that's ultimately what makes Stranger Things work. Not the monsters, not the powers, not the 80s nostalgia, although all of that helps. What makes it work is the care, the attention to detail, the willingness to spend time on the small things. A blue hairband, a 3-inch door gap, a solved Rubik's Cube, that make a fictional town in Indiana feel like a place where real people live. The Duffer Brothers were rejected 20 times before Netflix said yes. Millie Bobby Brown was told her career was over before she auditioned. Joe Keery was so likable that they rewrote their own show to keep him alive. Sean Astin was so lovable that they delayed his death by 4 episodes. Kate Bush was so talented that a song she wrote in 1985 went to #1 in 2022 because a fictional teenager played it on a Walkman to survive a psychic attack from a man who was once a boy in a lab who never had a friend. Everything in Stranger Things connects. Every character, every detail, every song, every monster traces back to the same idea. Connection matters. The people who reach out survive. The people who pull away don't. The show that nobody wanted became one of the most watched shows in history because 2 brothers from North Carolina believed that a story about kids with walkie-talkies fighting monsters in the dark was worth telling. 20 networks disagreed. Netflix didn't. And here we are. Season 5 is coming. The final chapter. And whatever happens, whoever lives, whoever dies, however they resolve the Vecna storyline and the Upside Down and the question of what Eleven ultimately becomes, I think the show has already earned its place. Not because of the CGI or the jump scares or the budget that grew from $6 million to $30 million per episode, but because of the hairband and the scrunchie and the 3-inch door and the Rubik's Cube nobody was supposed to see. The details, the quiet ones, the ones that don't make it into the trailer but make the show feel like home. That's Stranger Things. And if you're still listening at this point, you are either a dedicated fan or you fell asleep somewhere around the Steve Harrington segment, which is honestly fine because that was kind of the point. One last thing. I've spent this entire video talking about characters and episodes and behind-the-scenes details, but I think the most important thing about Stranger Things is something harder to put into words. It's a feeling. The feeling you get when the synth soundtrack kicks in and the title card appears. Those red letters against black, pulsing like a heartbeat. The feeling you get when a kid on a bike rides past the camera and the trees are dark and the street lights are orange and, you know, something is out there but you don't know what. That feeling is the show. Not the plot, not the monsters, the feeling. The sense that you're 11 years old again, sitting in the dark, watching something you're probably not old enough to watch, and loving every second of it. The Duffers captured something you can't manufacture. You can spend $1 billion on CGI and A-list talent and still not create the feeling of a kid whispering into a walkie-talkie in a dark basement while something impossible listens from the other side. That feeling comes from sincerity, from creators who genuinely love the stories they grew up with and want to share that love. Matt and Ross Duffer were born in 1984. They didn't live through the era they're homaging. They grew up watching movies about it. Their nostalgia is secondhand, and somehow that secondhand nostalgia produced something more authentic than most firsthand accounts. Maybe because they weren't constrained by what the 80s actually were. They were free to imagine what the 80s felt like. And feelings, it turns out, are more powerful than facts. That's the whole show. Two brothers who imagine what childhood felt like in a decade they barely remember. Cast a 12-year-old whose career was over before it began. And build a world where the most powerful weapon against darkness isn't telekinesis or technology or government conspiracies. It's friendship. It's a song on a Walkman. It's 3 inches of space in a doorway. It's a blue band on a wrist. The small things. The quiet details, the ones that show up in your chest at 2 a.m, when you're lying in the dark, thinking about a show about kids who fight monsters, and wondering why it makes you feel so much. There's always more lore to tell. I'll be here when you come back.